All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating, something that really kind of changed the landscape of how we see the world and how we interact with it. And that's the transition from black and white television to color television, especially for the baby boomer generation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really remarkable transition to look back on. It wasn't just about, better picture quality. It was
Yeah.
really a cultural revolution that really shaped the experiences of an entire generation. I mean, even maybe influencing, how we understand media today.
And thinking about it like that really puts it in perspective because, I think sometimes we take color for granted.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore some of the fascinating, details and stories from that period. We've got some great source material that we've been looking at that really illuminates this whole era.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for us to even imagine, television without color now, but this deep dive is going to uncover just how significant this Technicolor revolution was for those who lived through it.
Right. And for those of us who didn't, hopefully we can kind of gain a new appreciation for how we got to where we are today.
For sure.
So let's start by setting the stage.
Hmm.
Go back in time to the 1950s. You know, Black and white television is still a pretty new thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's quickly becoming like a centerpiece of family life.
Absolutely. And you have these iconic shows like I Love Lucy and the Ed Sullivan Show that really had this incredible power to bring families together.
Yeah.
Even without the visual richness that we're used to now with color.
Right. And it's funny because you can almost picture those families, you know, huddled around that black and white set, just completely captivated by those monochrome images.
Yeah, it speaks to the power of storytelling, at its core,
Yeah.
even without, all of the bells and whistles that we have today.
Right. I mean, the stories themselves were strong enough to draw people in. But as we move towards the late 1950s,
Hmm.
there's this push for color that starts to gain momentum.
Hmm.
What was driving that? What was the impetus for that?
Well, there were a couple of key factors. On the one hand, you had the manufacturers, particularly RCA was a major player there. And they were really, eager to perfect color broadcasting. There was a competitive element to it as
Yeah,
well.
of course.
They wanted to gain a market advantage.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, I think it also just came down to a natural human desire for a more realistic viewing experience.
Hmm.
People wanted to see the world on their screens, in all of its vibrancy.
And I imagine once the possibility of color was there,
Yeah.
black and white must have seemed kind of dull and lifeless.
Yeah. It definitely started to feel a little incomplete.
But of course, making that leap to color wasn't exactly a walk in the park. I mean, there were some pretty big hurdles to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the entire infrastructure for broadcasting had to be overhauled.
Hmm.
TV stations needed to invest in a whole new set of equipment that could transmit these color signals. And then for the average viewer, it meant a pretty significant investment to actually buy a color TV set.
So it was a pretty gradual transition that required, buy-in from both sides,
Yeah.
the producers and the consumers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a big shift.
But there seems to have been a sort of tipping point, a moment when color really went mainstream.
And that moment was 1966. It was a watershed year when NBC made the bold decision to broadcast its entire primetime lineup in color.
Wow.
So that was a huge statement. It basically said color TV was here to stay. It was the future.
And I imagine that created a sense of urgency for people to get on board.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you wanted to be in the loop,
Yeah,
if you want to be part of the cultural conversation, you kind of needed a color TV.
exactly, yeah.
And it's interesting that this coincides with the emergence of some really visually stunning programs.
Yeah, shows like Star Trek. I mean, think about all those colorful alien worlds and costumes. And then you have the wonderful world of Disney, which, had always been about visual spectacle.
Right.
But suddenly, color just amplify all of that.
And took it to a whole new level.
Exactly, yeah.
It's amazing to think about how much more immersive,
Uh-huh.
the viewing experience must have been.
Mhm.
And, behind all of this technological innovation, there were some really key figures, some real champions of color television.
Yeah.
Who stands out to you?
Well, David Sarnoff,
Yeah.
the head of RCA,
Mm.
he was a true visionary. He recognized the potential of color TV really early on and just, relentlessly advocated for its development and adoption, really put a lot of resources behind it.
And then there's the story of Dr. Peter Goldmark.
Yes.
What was his role in all of this?
He was instrumental in developing the color television system for CBS. Now, RCA's system ultimately became the industry standard,
Right.
but Goldmark's work and the competition that it fostered,
Right.
really pushed innovation forward.
That's so interesting.
It shows that, even competing ideas can drive progress in a big way.
And it's a reminder that progress isn't always linear. There are these different paths, these competing visions that shape the outcome.
Yeah.
And of course, this transition to color wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening alongside all these other huge societal changes in the 1960s.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
How did the two connect? How did color television, kind of intersect with those broader changes?
Well, I mean, if you look at it, color TV emerged during a period of, just incredible social and cultural upheaval. The civil rights movement, you had the rise of new music and fashion, the space race. I mean, the world was becoming a much more vibrant and dynamic place.
Right.
And color television, in a way, kind of mirrored that. It amplified that vibrancy.
Yeah. So it wasn't just entertainment. It was a way of connecting people to those pivotal moments, to those cultural shifts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in a much more visceral way.
Right. You could see the emotion. You could see the nuances that black and white just couldn't capture.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of, kind of interesting details.
Yeah.
I know you've uncovered some pretty quirky facts about this era.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Anything stand out to you?
Well, did you know that the first color TV commercial, way back in 1954, was actually for chocolate bars?
You're kidding.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, you think about this groundbreaking technology, being used to sell, something so commonplace.
Wow.
It's kind of funny.
That's a great little detail.
And of course, one phrase that really captures, the arrival of color TV is that iconic slogan, the following program is brought to you in living color.
Oh, yeah. I could almost hear the announcer saying it.
Right.
So, as we look back on this transition from black and white to color, what do you think is the most important takeaway, especially for the baby boomers who lived through it?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that it was so much more than just a technological upgrade.
Right.
It really was a cultural watershed moment that had a profound impact on an entire generation.
And really, it shaped how they saw the world.
Absolutely.
It shaped their relationship with media.
Yeah.
And those effects are still being felt today.
Yeah, for sure.
It's amazing to think about, something that we just take for granted now.
Yeah.
Color TV, how revolutionary it was.
Yeah, it's quite a story, from those early days of, families huddled around a monochrome screen
Right.
to the, just the explosion of color that unlocked all these new creative possibilities and new ways of seeing the world.
And, it really makes you wonder how that shift, from black and white to color, how it affected the baby boomer generation's perception of the world. How did it change the way they interacted with things?
Yeah.
And even more broadly, did it lay the groundwork for the kinds of immersive visual experiences that we have today? From high-definition screens to virtual reality. It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it really is.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.